let me ask now about the Voice campaign. What do you make of John Farnham getting involved?
Well, Andrew, I think first point is that, I'm an 80s child, grew up in the 80s. Every Australian is happy with the news that John is making a recovery from a pretty serious condition, obviously, and we wish him and his family, every best wish and hope for a very bright future for him. I think the problem at the moment is not that entertainers and people from the top end of town are supporting the Voice or lending their support to it. It's that the Prime Minister won't support the public in their decision making. He's deliberately withholding information, and withholding that information until after the election. I mean, he's been very clear about that. He'll give you the detail after the vote has taken place, which is quite remarkable. So I think, in a sense, it's the appropriate theme song for the Yes campaign, because remember the key line in the lyrics there is, you're the voice, try and understand it. And I don't want to sing it. I don't want to break into verse with you here, Andrew. But I honestly don't think I don't think most Australians understand it, and they want to be informed. There are good people on the yes and no case, or who have decided to vote yes or no. But there are many people in the middle who just say, well, I've got a big hesitation here. It's going in the Constitution. It's going to be permanent. I think it's divisive. There are many reasons that people have a hesitation. The Prime Minister is making a deliberate decision not to help people understand what the Voice is about.
Numbers suggest the No campaign will win, and those numbers have declined for the Yes campaign since you made the decision to oppose enshrining a voice in the Constitution. Do you accept, if it goes down, your opposition to it will be a major factor, if not the deciding factor in that?
Well, Andrew, a couple of points. I mean, one is that on the latest news poll, 29% of Labor voters are voting no. So 1 in 3 Labor supporters will vote no at the upcoming referendum. Now, that's not something that's motivated by my position, I suspect. It's because of the reasons that I outlined before. The PM is just being tricky and sneaky and not providing the information. Second point is that I wrote to the Prime Minister in January of this year with 15 reasonable questions on behalf of millions of Australians who just wanted to know the detail. The Prime Minister has still not answered that letter. He's still not provided the detail. He's not answered the questions and given the information to the Australian people. I went through many Indigenous communities right across the country, speaking to elders, speaking to women, to grandmothers in those communities about what the Voice would mean for them, whether they supported it, whether it was going to provide the practical outcomes to them on the ground. I considered it for a long period of time. I took legal advice, and my considered view was that this was not in our country's best interests, and that it was not going to provide the practical outcomes for Indigenous Australians in regional and remote areas that we all want. And that's the problem. This is a $450 million exercise the Prime Minister is embarking on here. He's dividing the nation, and I think that money could be much better spent in building boarding houses in Indigenous schools in Alice Springs and providing safety for those kids today. But that's not what the Prime Minister is doing here. He's after some sort of legacy for his time in office.
All right.
It's not going to benefit the Australian public.
We're nearly out of time. I have a couple of things I want to ask you about before we go. So this is former New South Wales Liberal Premier Mike Baird on The Voice last week.
My hope would be that there's one last chance for the Prime Minister and the Leader Opposition to actually come together. Like there's a lot of similarities. There are things they agree with. It might take some compromise on both sides, but I think for the good of the country, for the good of Indigenous communities across Australia, I think it would be a great thing if there was one last chance to try and find that unified position.
Do you reckon you and Anthony Albanese could come to a unified position now? I mean, you do support regional voices, for example.
I hope that we can come to a position of consensus, because I think it would be in the national interest to do so. And my offer to the Prime Minister has been that we fully support recognition of Indigenous Australians in the Constitution. That would be a huge step, and it would be a unifying moment like 1967 was for our country. That is open to the Prime Minister today. We're sitting for the fortnight in Canberra. Parliament can pass legislation on a joint basis. I'm happy to sit down, in addition to that, with the Prime Minister to work up legislation that listens to the Karma Langton report, which provides for a regional body, a local body, those women in Alice Springs, Laverton, Leonora, other places that we've been, for them to be heard, but not to have it enshrined in the Constitution because it's permanent and it's divisive there. And that's the position. I think it's a fair compromise. But the Prime Minister...
It's a bit confusing, though, Mr Dutton. When you support a voice, you support a voice, don't you? So the voice isn't a bad concept to you. OK.
Listening to people is not a bad concept. I mean, that's very clear. But as we saw in Western Australia, somebody who wanted to dig a post hole or put a concrete slab in for a shed, wanted to move 4 kilos worth of dirt, had to get a report from a Aboriginal cultural expert, right, at the cost of hundreds or thousands of dollars. That was in legislation. Had it been in the Constitution, it wouldn't have been abolished. It couldn't have been abolished.
All right.
There's no law the Parliament can pass to out-rule the Constitution.
Mr Dutton, if the voice fails, what's your solution to closing the gap? What would you do in government?
Well, Andrew, I would take up the advice of those women that we've spoken to. They're not interested in a voice in another layer of bureaucracy of 24 elite people, appointed working out of Canberra. I think they want a safe environment for their kids. They want an education for their children, their grandchildren. They want employment opportunities.
How would you do that?
Housing. I would work very closely, predominantly with the Northern Territory government, but also the Western Australia and the Queensland government as well. The issue for us, the most acute issue, is in the remote and regional areas. And frankly, it's not just Indigenous kids or Indigenous families in remote WA. It's also non-Indigenous communities that are missing out on health services, the maternal health services, for example. We've got a scheme on the table which is fully supported by teachers and principals to try and provide accommodation at the places of learning, at the schools, so that the kids can be fed there, they can be accommodated there overnight. That reduces the incidence of domestic violence, of sexual violence. Restoring law and order is the first priority to it, providing that intervention at an early age for those kids. They're the first steps that the government should be making now that would actually move the dial. But the Prime Minister's not taken that.
All right, Mr Dutton, sorry, we're nearly out of time, but I'll just ask you very briefly. The PM says if this fails, that's it. Would you commit to a referendum question on constitutional recognition of First Nations people alone in your first term of government or at your second election if elected? Would you have another referendum for constitutional recognition in that term?
We went to the last election and a number of elections before that with that as our policy, and that will be our policy going into the next election as well. I think it's right and respectful to recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution. We will work with the Labor Party to find a common ground. But the Prime Minister having this dummy spit, it reminds me of Kevin Rudd, that this is the greatest moral challenge of our time. But if you don't get your own way, then everyone else can bugger off. And
so you'd hold another referendum
of Australians.
So you'd hold another referendum.
I believe very strongly. Yes, I believe very strongly that it is the right thing to do. But enshrining a voice in the Constitution is divisive. It will divide the country down the middle. It will not provide the practical outcomes. It will change the way of government very significantly because of the broad words the Prime Minister is proposing to put into the Constitution against legal advice, I might say. And I think it would grind the process of government decision-making to a near halt. And I think we would change our country quite dramatically. And that's why people, including 1 in 3 Labor voters, don't support the voice.
Mr Dutton, thanks so much for your time this morning. Happy Father's Day.
Thank you, Andrew, and to you. Thank you.